Ground had not the anteed to give him up. For 3 nights, Naomi Carver had worked the frozen earth behind the house with a shovel and a pick, breaking through crust that resisted like stone, until at last, just before first light, the hole was deep enough. Old Mr. Whitfield had come up from his place at the bend of the creek to help her lower the plain pine box, and now the two of them stood together in the grey cold, breath rising in pale clouds, while the sky over the ridge turned the color of ash, and then, slowly, the color of a bruise healing. She had expected to weep. She had braced for it for weeks, ever since the doctor in town had pressed his lips together and told her there was nothing more to be done for Elia's lungs, that the fever and the coughing would only get worse until it stopped altogether. But standing there at dawn, watching Whitfield shovel the first scoops of dirt onto the box, what rose in Naomi's chest was not grief in the shape she had imagined. It was something quieter and more shameful, a kind of stillness. As if a long-held breath had finally been let out. "You don't have to stay for all of it," Whitfield said, not unkindly, pausing with the shovel in his hands. "Go on in and see to the girl. I'll finish here." Naomi looked toward the house, where a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney and a small face was pressed to the frosted window glass, watching them. Etta had not cried either. 7 years old, and she had not cried once since her father took his last breath 3 nights ago, only grown quieter, smaller, as though she were trying to take up less space in a house that suddenly had too much room in it. "Thank you, Walter," Naomi said, "for all of it. The digging, the box, I don't know how I'd have managed." "Elias was a hard man," Whitfield said carefully, "but he kept his fences mended and never once cheated me on a trade. That counts for something out here." He drove the shovel into the dirt pile again. "You'll get through the winter. Carvers always do." She did not correct him, though the thought crossed her mind that she was not a Carver by blood, only by marriage, and that the name had never quite fit her the way her own had. She only nodded, pulled her shawl tighter against the wind coming down off the ridge, and walked back toward the house, where her daughter waited. The day passed the way days did on the ranch, regardless of what had been buried that morning. The 2 milk cows needed tending, the chickens needed feeding, and the woodpile, depleted by the long sickness that had kept the stove burning day and night for a month, needed splitting and stacking before the next snow came. Naomi worked through it with the methodical numbness of someone who had run out of places to put her feelings, and Etta trailed behind her in the yard, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, carrying small armfuls of kindling without being asked. By mid-afternoon, the sky had changed. What had been merely cold and grey that morning thickened into something heavier, the clouds rolling down from the mountains in a long unbroken shelf, and the wind picked up enough to set the bare branches of the cottonwoods clattering against each other like dry bones. Naomi had lived in this country long enough to know what that meant. She drove the cows into the barn earlier than usual, threw extra hay into their stalls, and checked the latch on the chicken coop twice. "Storm's coming," she told Etta, lifting her up onto the porch step. "A big one, I think. We'll want the lamps filled and the door barred early tonight." Etta nodded, solemn, and said nothing, and Naomi felt the familiar ache of wishing her daughter would simply cry or shout or ask why her father wasn't coming back. Anything but this careful, watchful silence. The snow began just after dark, first as a fine dry hiss against the windows, then thickening until the lantern light from inside barely reached past the porch rail. Naomi had banked the stove, set a pot of beans to simmer, and was helping Etta into her nightgown when the dog began to bark. Scout was an old blue-eyed mutt who had wandered onto the place years ago and never left, and in all that time Naomi had rarely heard him bark at anything except coyotes circling the chicken coop. This was different. He was at the front door, hackles up, barking in short, urgent bursts, and beneath the rising wind Naomi heard something else. A knock, heavy, uneven, like a fist that did not have much strength left behind it. For a moment she did not move. A woman alone with a child, miles from the nearest neighbor, on the night she had buried her husband, every instinct told her to blow out the lamp and stay still and silent until whatever it was went away. But the knock came again, weaker this time, followed by a voice, hoarse and barely carrying over the storm. "Please, anyone in there? My horse went down in the ravine." Naomi crossed to the window and wiped a clear patch in the frost with her sleeve. Through the swirling white, she could just make out a shape on the porch, hunched against the door, one arm wrapped around the porch post as though it were the only thing holding him upright. She took down the rifle from above the door frame, more out of habit than any real intention, and called through the wood. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Name's Caleb Hart," the voice answered, teeth audibly chattering. "I was riding for Sweetwater when the storm came down. My horse stepped wrong on the ravine trail and I had to leave him. I've been walking maybe 2 hours. I saw your light. I don't want trouble, ma'am, I swear it. Just somewhere out of this wind, even the barn would do." Naomi looked back at Etta, who stood frozen by the bed, eyes wide. Then she looked at the rifle in her hands and at the storm rattling the window panes, and did the arithmetic any person raised on this land learned early. A man left out in weather like this past midnight would not be alive by morning, and whatever else she was not going to have that on her conscience, not on this day of all days. She set the rifle within reach on the table, but did not put it away, and opened the door. The man who half fell across the threshold was younger than his voice had suggested, perhaps 30, with several days of dark stubble crusted with ice, and a coat so soaked through it had begun to stiffen at the shoulders. He carried a saddlebag slung over one arm, and when he straightened, wincing, Naomi saw that he was favoring his left leg. "Sit by the stove," she said, her voice flatter and more commanding than she felt. "Don't touch anything else." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something in the careful, exhausted gratitude of it that eased the knot in her chest, just slightly. He sat where she told him, close enough to the stove that the melting ice in his coat began to drip onto the floorboards, and for a while no one spoke. Etta had crept to the doorway of the back room and stood watching the stranger with the same wide, careful eyes she had watched the burial that morning. Scout, after a few more suspicious sniffs at the man's boots, settled down near the stove as well, apparently satisfied. "You said Sweetwater," Naomi said finally, ladling a bowl of beans and setting it, without quite meeting his eyes, on the small table beside him. "That's 2 days' ride from here, even in good weather. What's a man doing out on the ravine trail alone this time of year?" "Looking for work," Caleb said. He wrapped both hands around the bowl as though it were the warmth itself he wanted, more than the food. "Heard there was a outfit up near Sweetwater hiring hands for the winter cattle drive to the rail spur. I was headed that way from down south." He glanced at her, then at Etta in the doorway, then back at the bowl. "I'm obliged to you, ma'am. I mean that. I wasn't sure I'd see morning out there." "You might not have, the way that leg looks," Naomi said. "Let me see it." He hesitated, then rolled up his trouser leg enough to show an ankle swollen tight against the boot leather, already darkening with bruise. Naomi had set enough bones and wrapped enough sprains in her years on the ranch, for Elias, for the hired men who came and went, even once for herself, that she did not need to ask twice before fetching strips of clean cloth and a basin of water. "It's not broken," she said, after pressing along the bone with careful fingers while he hissed through his teeth. "Bad sprain. You won't be walking far on it for a few days." "A few days," he repeated, and something crossed his face, not quite alarm, but the look of a man doing sums he didn't like the answer to. "Ma'am, I don't want to impose. If I could just stay in the barn till the storm breaks." "The barn's no place for a man with a leg like that, not in this cold," Naomi said, more sharply than she intended, and then softer, "You'll sleep by the stove tonight. We'll see about the rest in the morning." He nodded and did not argue further, and something about the way he simply accepted it. No flattery, no insistence, no attempt to make himself more welcome than he had been invited to be, settled something in Naomi that she had not realized was unsettled. She did not sleep much that night, listening to the wind and to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in the front room, but when she rose before dawn to stoke the stove, she found Caleb already awake, sitting up against the wall, very still, careful not to wake anyone, and Scout's head resting against his good leg. The storm did not break the next day, nor the day after. It settled over Cedar Hollow the way storms sometimes did in that country, burying the yard in drifts that reached the windowsills, turning the world outside into a featureless white nothing through which the barn was only a darker smudge 50 feet away. With Caleb's ankle too swollen to bear weight on uneven ground, and the wind too fierce to send a man out searching for a dead horse he'd never find, there was simply nothing to do but wait it out together. It would have been easy, in those first days, for the silence between them to curdle into something awkward or worse. Instead, Naomi found that Caleb had a way of making himself useful from where he sat, mending a torn harness strap with an awl and waxed thread, whittling a new handle for a hatchet that had split, showing Etta, without making a show of it, how to carve a small wooden horse from a block of pine scrap. That was how it started with Etta, not with questions, which the girl would not have answered, but with the wood shavings curling onto the floor and the slow, patient shape emerging under Caleb's knife, and Etta's silence becoming, gradually, the silence of someone watching closely rather than someone hiding. "You've got a steady hand for whittling," Naomi observed on the third evening as Caleb passed the finished horse, rough, but recognizably a horse, with a proudly arched neck, into Etta's waiting hands. "My pa taught me," Caleb said, "whittled half my toys growing up, couldn't afford to buy them, so he made them." He watched Etta turn the little horse over in her hands, testing its legs against the tabletop to see if it could stand. "Had a daughter myself once, about her age when he stopped." Naomi did not press. She had learned, in her own grief, how a sentence could simply end like that, and how cruel it was to ask someone to finish it before they were ready. "There was a fire," Caleb said anyway after a moment, his eyes on the stove rather than on her. 3 years back near Abilene, my wife and my girl were in the house. I was out with the herd 2 miles off, and by the time I got back there wasn't." He shook his head once sharply, as if to dislodge the memory. "I've been moving since. Don't rightly know what I'm moving toward. Just away, mostly." The wind howled against the shuttered window, and the stove popped and settled, and for a long time neither of them said anything more. Naomi found herself looking at her own hands, work-roughened and chapped from years of wringing wash water and milking cows, and more recently, from changing the dressings on a dying man's chest. "Elias and I were married 11 years, she said finally, the words coming slow, as though she were testing whether they were even true before she let them out. "He wasn't a cruel man, never raised a hand to me, never to Etta. But he wasn't," she searched for the word. "He wasn't warm, not to me, not really to her either, not in a way she could feel. I used to think that was just how some men were built, and maybe I was right, but it made for a quiet kind of loneliness, living in the same house as someone for 11 years and never once feeling like you'd been truly seen by them." She looked up and found Caleb watching her, not with pity, which she would have hated, but with something steadier, recognition maybe. "This morning, standing over his grave," she went on, and her voice dropped almost to a whisper, as though the confession were too heavy to say at full volume, "I didn't feel sad, Mr. Hart, not the way I thought a widow was supposed to feel. I felt relieved. And then I felt ashamed of feeling relieved, on the very day I buried him, with my daughter standing right there." She pressed her lips together. "I haven't said that to a living soul. I don't know why I'm saying it to a stranger I pulled out of a snowstorm." "Maybe because I am a stranger," Caleb said quietly. "Easier to say a true thing to someone who'll be gone in a few days than to someone who'll still be looking at you next spring." "Maybe," Naomi agreed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself almost smiling, though there was little enough humor in it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised her with how natural it felt. As Caleb's ankle improved enough to bear weight, he insisted on helping with the chores the storm had piled up, breaking ice on the water trough, forking hay down for the cows, splitting wood with the hatchet he'd repaired himself, moving carefully but steadily despite the brace Naomi had wrapped around his ankle. He never overstepped, never made himself master of the place the way some hired men did the moment they saw a woman running things alone, but he filled the gaps that 2 pairs of hands could fill better than one, and Naomi found herself, for the first time in months, not bone-tired by the end of each day. The real test came 8 days after Caleb's arrival, when one of the milk cows, heavy, with a calf that had come early, or perhaps the cold had brought it on, went into a difficult labor in the night. Naomi heard the cow's distress through the barn wall before she was fully awake, and by the time she had pulled on her boots and coat and crossed the yard with a lantern, Caleb was already there ahead of her, having heard it too, kneeling in the straw beside the laboring animal. "Calf's turned wrong," he said without looking up. "Can feel a leg folded back. We've got to get it straightened or we'll lose them both." What followed was an hour that Naomi would remember in fragments rather than in order. The cow's labored breathing, the lantern light swinging wildly as Scout paced and whined by the barn door, her own arm, slicked to the shoulder, working alongside Caleb's as they fought to reposition the calf's folded leg inside the birth canal, both of them too focused and too frightened to speak, except in short, urgent instructions. At one point, Caleb's hand closed briefly over hers, getting it to where he could feel the joint that needed to be turned, and in the cold, dark barn, with the cow groaning and the wind screaming outside, it did not feel like anything except two people trying desperately to save a life together. When the calf finally came, slick and steaming in the cold air, and gave its first shuddering breath, Naomi sat back hard in the straw, shaking, and found that she was laughing, a startled, exhausted laugh that had grief and relief, and something like joy all tangled together in it. Caleb was laughing too, wiping his hands on a rag, and when their eyes met across the newborn calf struggling to its feet for the first time, something passed between them that neither of them tried to name. "We make a fair team, ma'am," Caleb said, "for someone who near shot me on sight a week back." "I never had the rifle cocked," Naomi said, "not even once." "Didn't say you did," he said, and there was warmth in it now, easy in a way it hadn't been before. "Just an observation." The storm broke fully 2 days later, leaving behind a world scoured white and impossibly bright under hard winter sun, and with the trails passable again, Caleb spoke of going on to Sweetwater, of the work he'd been chasing before the storm took his horse and nearly his life along with it. Naomi found, packing a small bundle of food for his journey, that her hands were unsteady, and that she was angry at herself for how much the thought of his leaving unsettled her. "You're certain about Sweetwater?" she asked, not looking at him, busying herself with wrapping a wedge of cheese in cloth. "Cattle drive work in the dead of winter is a hard way to earn wages, and you'd be walking there on an ankle that's not fully healed." "I am certain of very little these days, Mrs. Carver," Caleb said. He was standing by the door, his saddlebag over his shoulder, and his voice was careful, the way a man's voice gets when he is choosing each word with more weight than usual. "Truth is, I've been moving for 3 years because staying still meant remembering, and I didn't think I could bear remembering. But these last days, working this place, I haven't felt like I was running from anything. First time in a long while." Naomi set down the cheese. "This ranch is more than I can manage alone come spring," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, though her heart was not. "Fences need mending, the herd needs to grow back what the winter takes, and Etta," she glanced toward the back room where her daughter sat cross-legged on the floor, walking the small wooden horse in slow circles, humming quietly to herself for the first time since her father's death. "Etta could use someone steady around. So could I, if I'm honest about it." "Are you offering me work, Mrs. Carver?" Caleb asked, and though his tone was light, his eyes were not. "I'm offering you a place to stop moving, Mr. Hart," Naomi said. "What it becomes after that, I expect that's up to both of us, and we needn't decide it all today." Caleb looked at the saddlebag in his hand, then set it down slowly by the door, the way a man sets down something he has been carrying so long he had nearly forgotten its weight. Outside, the sun glinted hard and clean off the snow, and somewhere in the barn the new calf bawled for its mother, and Etta's quiet humming drifted from the back room. And for the first time since she had stood over a frozen grave at dawn, Naomi Carver felt something in her chest that was neither grief nor relief nor shame, but simply, cautiously, the beginning of something good. Spring would come slow to Cedar Hollow that year, as it always did, but when it came, there would be fences mended, and a calf grown sturdy in the pasture, and a small wooden horse worn smooth from a child's hands, and a man who had stopped running, standing in the yard at dusk, beside a woman who had stopped waiting for someone to truly see her, both of them, at last, exactly where they meant to be.